Welcome, my dear friend. Let everything slow. The galaxy is old, older than any civilization currently alive within it, older than the wars currently being fought across it, older than the gods that currently feed on it. The lights that human astronomers observe from Terra are the light of suns that, in some cases, no longer exist. The photons of dead stars still travelling toward receivers who will never know what they are looking at. What appears current from a sufficient distance is often history. The galaxy operates on timescales that biological creatures, whose attention is shaped by lifespans measured in decades or centuries, tend to process as background rather than as the primary fact of everything they inhabit. The Eldar knew the galaxy differently. They had been in it long enough to measure not just their own history, but the history of the things they had found there. They had been there before humanity was recognizably itself. They had been there before the orcs they displaced toward the galaxy's edges had developed the warlike culture that would make them a persistent nuisance. They had been there, in some form, since the close of the war in heaven, the conflict so ancient that the civilizations that participated in it are now either extinct or transformed beyond recognition. They called themselves the First People. In the context of what they had been and what they had built, the name was accurate. Tonight we begin before the fall. In the galaxy, those people had made their own, with the 13 facts about what the Eldar were that make the fall comprehensible, rather than only catastrophic. What the Old Ones made. The Eldar did not evolve in the way that most intelligent species in the Warhammer 40,000 universe evolved. They were made, the Old Ones, the ancient and unknowable beings who had seeded the galaxy with life, and who had built the webway, and who had attempted to resist the Necrons and their star god masters during the war in heaven, created the Eldar as weapons. This origin matters for understanding what the Eldar were in the fullness of their civilization. The Old Ones, facing an enemy with no psychic presence, an enemy of metal and cold will whose nature was specifically defined by the absence of the warp, had chosen to answer that absence with intensity. They gave the Eldar the most powerful psychic potential of any biological race they had created. Not a modest gift. Not the degree of psychic sensitivity that produces the occasional psyker in a human population. The kind of psychic connection to the warp that made each Eldar, individually, a presence in that immaterial dimension, comparable to many human psykers combined. The depth of emotion that accompanied this gift was not incidental. It was the mechanism. The warp, which is the reflection and repository of the emotional and psychological states of the galaxy's living beings, responds to intensity. The Old Ones wanted the Eldar to be capable of things in the warp that no other biological race could achieve. They gave them the emotional depth that made those things possible. What they created was a race whose inner life exceeded the inner life of other races, the way an ocean exceeds a puddle. Every Eldar experienced every moment of their existence at a pitch that humans, whose psychic potential was distributed more thinly across a much larger population, would have found overwhelming. Joy was a different thing in an Eldar than in a human. Grief was a different thing. Love, ambition, hatred, curiosity. Every one of these states was experienced at a depth and with an intensity that the human words for them only approximate. The Eldar did not consider this a burden in the age of their greatness. They considered it what they were. The intensity of experience was the texture of Eldar existence, the quality that distinguished the First People from the lesser races that occupied the galaxy alongside them. They were more, in their own assessment, than anything else that lived. They were not wrong about the intensity. They were wrong about whether intensity alone was a sufficient quality to build a civilization on indefinitely. The Webway and the Galaxy. The Webway was the infrastructure of Eldar dominion, the network of tunnels through subspace, constructed by the Old Ones and maintained and extended by the Eldar across millennia of their civilization, that allowed travel across the galaxy without entering the warp. A gate in one location, a journey through the tunnel, a gate in another location vastly distant. No exposure to the dangers of warp travel. No need for the Geller fields that would one day protect human ships from what lived in the immaterial. A transit network that made the galaxy's distances manageable rather than lethal. The Webway was why the Eldar occupied a large portion of the galaxy at the height of their power. Not all of it, because even the Webway's network had limits, and because the Orcs and the other races that the Old Ones had created had their own territories and their own stubborn resistance to displacement. But enough that the Eldar concept of the galaxy was not the concept of a species constrained to a small volume of space around its home star, but the concept of a species that moved through the galaxy the way a people might move through a continent they had spent centuries exploring and claiming. They built paradise worlds, hundreds of them seeded across the galaxy, created by Eldar terraforming technology and maintained as retreats and colonies and expressions of what a civilization with resources and time that had no practical ceiling did with the places it found. The paradise worlds were the most visible expression of Eldar confidence in their dominion. The certainty that the galaxy was theirs to shape, that its uninhabited planets were raw material for Eldar purposes, that the time required to transform a world from its natural state into something beautiful was available in abundance. Other races were displaced. The Orcs, whose own creation by the Old Ones had produced a species with different priorities and different strengths, were pushed toward the galaxy's edges. The Scythor fiends and other species of the ancient galaxy, some of them civilizations in their own right by any measure that did not compare them to the Eldar, were defeated and absorbed or removed outright. The Eldar's relationship to the other life they shared the galaxy with was not the relationship of neighbors who negotiated space. It was the relationship of an apex species that had the capacity to do what it wanted and the confidence to act on that capacity. Human civilization had not yet developed to a point of galactic significance. The species that would one day name itself after its homeworld and go on to build the Imperium was still in its early phases. The scattered federation of worlds and void stations and fledgling colonies that preceded the emergence of the Emperor. The Eldar, looking at humanity in this period, saw something with potential and very little achievement. They did not look long or closely. The technology of the first people. The Eldar had built machines that thought. Not thought in the limited sense of the calculating engines that humanity would later produce. Machines that processed inputs and produced outputs within the parameters of their design. Machines that were, by any functional definition, minds. The psychomatons and spirit drones that the Eldar had developed to perform the physical labor that an advanced civilization requires. This achievement had a specific consequence for Eldar society. When the machines that thought could perform all physical labor, all manufacturing, all maintenance, all the tasks that civilizations need performed to sustain themselves, the people for whom those machines worked were freed from the necessity of work in the fundamental sense. Not freed in the sense of having more leisure. Freed in the sense of having no category of activity that the species required of them, What a civilization does with its population when the population is no longer required for anything is a question that the galaxy's various species have answered in different ways. The Eldars' answer, in the fullness of their golden age, was to pursue desire, not in the degraded sense that the Fall would later produce. In the early centuries and millennia of the Golden Age, the pursuit of desire meant art, philosophy, exploration of the self and of the world, the development of magical traditions whose sophistication was unmatched in the galaxy, the construction of cultural achievements that the surviving Craftworlds still carry fragments of. The Eldar in the Golden Age's early period were creating things of genuine beauty and genuine profundity, expressing the psychic intensity that the Old Ones had built into them through forms that the galaxy had not seen before and hasn't matched since. The trap was not visible from inside the beauty. The problem with a civilization built on the unimpeded pursuit of desire is not that desire is bad. It is that desire, unimpeded, tends to escalate. What was sufficient yesterday produces less response today. What was intense becomes familiar. The nervous system, or the psychic architecture that in the Eldar served the functions the nervous system served, adapts to the level of stimulation it regularly receives and requires more to produce the same effect. This is true for any being capable of experiencing desire. For beings whose psychic intensity exceeded that of all other races, whose connection to the warp meant that their emotional states were not merely felt but broadcast, not merely personal but accumulated across the population, the escalation had consequences that extended beyond the individual. The warp and the echo chamber. The warp in the Warhammer 40,000 universe is not a passive dimension. It reflects and responds to the emotional states of the galaxy's living beings. What the galaxy's population feels collectively over sufficient time and at sufficient intensity takes shape in the warp. The great storms and tides of the immaterial are the weather system of emotion made physical, though physical is not quite the right word for a dimension that operates by different rules. The Eldar, whose psychic presence in the warp was orders of magnitude stronger than that of any other race, had the most significant effect on the warp of any beings alive. When an Eldar experienced joy, the warp registered it at a scale that individual human joy did not approach. When billions of Eldar experienced the escalating desires of the Golden Age's later period, the accumulated emotional output was registering in the warp at a scale that could not fail to produce something. The warp responds to what it receives. It does not evaluate the content of what it receives. It does not distinguish between the joy of beauty experienced and the satisfaction of cruelty inflicted. It responds to intensity, and intensity was what the Eldar produced. The seers of the Golden Age, who were paying attention to the warp rather than to the pleasures of the paradise worlds, saw something forming. Not a clear image, not a prediction with a specific date, something growing, something that was fed by what the Eldar were producing, and that, as it fed, grew more capable of feeding, a presence that had not been there before the Golden Age's later excesses began, and that was becoming more defined as those excesses intensified. Some of them said something, the seers who recognized what was forming and understood, from their knowledge of the warp's nature and the history of what psychic output at sufficient scale had produced, that the thing forming was dangerous, that the Eldar civilization was feeding something that would, when it was sufficiently fed, cease to be content with being fed. The Golden Age's established powers did not want to hear this. A civilization that had been dominant for millennia, that had defeated every threat it had encountered, that possessed the most advanced technology in the galaxy and the most powerful psychic tradition, had difficulty processing a warning whose nature was that the civilization's own pleasures were the source of its coming destruction. The mechanism of the danger was too internal, too inseparable from what the civilization considered its nature, to be easy to accept. Some of the seers were dismissed as fanatics obsessed with self-denial. Some were derided for their attachment to old disciplines that the civilization had outgrown. A few were listened to, which is how some of the people who survived the fall came to survive it. But the thing in the warp kept growing. What it felt like to be Eldar. This part of the story requires a pause to consider something that the military and theological facts of the fall tend to crowd out: what the Eldar experience was like, at the level of what it felt to inhabit an Eldar life, in the years before the Golden Age's excesses became what they became. The Eldar, when they died, did not go to whatever destination mortal souls ordinarily went. Their psychic presence in the warp was powerful enough that their spirits, on death, returned to that dimension as coherent entities rather than dissolving into the background. In the Golden Age, this was understood as a form of continued existence. The Eldar dead were in the warp, present in some sense, accessible in some sense to the living through the psychic traditions the Eldar had developed. This relationship to death was one of the things that distinguished Eldar existence from human existence. A human being facing mortality faces a boundary beyond which continuity of self is uncertain. An Eldar of the Golden Age faced a transition rather than an ending. The body's cessation followed by the spirit's continued presence in the immaterial. The fear of death that shaped so much of human culture and human psychology had a different character in an Eldar who understood that death was a change of state rather than a conclusion, combined with a psychic intensity that made every moment of Eldar existence more vivid than the equivalent human moment, and the extended lifespans that the Eldar enjoyed. This produced a species that experienced the world at a depth and across a duration that no human could match. The Eldar of the Golden Age had thousands of years of intense experience behind them. They had accumulated the kind of knowledge and the kind of relationship to experience that only time at that emotional register can produce. They had also developed, across those thousands of years, a more and more sophisticated relationship to what desire required. Beings who have experienced everything that their culture offers in normal circumstances begin, across sufficient time, to look for circumstances that their culture does not normally offer. The novelty that sustains interest over a human lifetime of decades requires, in an Eldar lifetime of millennia, a different and more intensive search. The Golden Age had provided the means for that search without providing the understanding of what the search would produce when conducted by a species with the Eldar's particular relationship to the warp. The Craftworld builders and the Exodites. Not all the Eldar of the Golden Age's later period were participating in what it was becoming. The lore preserves the existence of two groups who saw what was happening and chose different responses. The first group left early. The Exodites, the Eldar who found what their civilization was becoming intolerable and who departed before the final stage had been reached, went to the uninhabited worlds at the galaxy's edges. They gave up the paradise worlds and the psychometons and the accumulated comforts of the Golden Age and went to worlds that were untamed and difficult, where the labor the machines had been performing required physical effort again, where the intensity of the surrounding civilization was replaced by the intensity of survival in demanding environments. They took the path that the path system would later codify, the discipline of focusing on one thing at a time, of directing the Eldar's psychic intensity toward a specific skill or vocation, rather than into the undirected desire that the Golden Age's pleasures encouraged. The Exodites developed this not as a philosophy, but as a practical necessity. In difficult environments, unfocused desire was a luxury that physical reality could not sustain. The second group stayed almost to the end. The Eldar who built the Craftworlds, the vast ships sung from Wraithbone that would carry the survivors through the fall, were the ones who recognized what was coming and made the largest possible preparations before it arrived. Each Craftworld was constructed to carry everything that could be saved from a single Eldar homeworld. The uncorrupted people from that world, the works of art and the plant life and the animals and the cultural fragments that could be gathered and loaded before time ran out. A homeworld compressed into a ship, because the homeworld itself was not going to survive what was coming. The builders of the Craftworlds did not know, when they began building, the precise form the catastrophe would take. They knew something was forming in the warp. They knew the civilization's trajectory was producing it. They knew enough to build, and not enough to specify what they were building against. They built anyway. It was the wisest thing done in the late Golden Age, and it was done by people who were watching everyone around them refuse to do it. Sleep well. Tomorrow the Golden Age ends the way all Golden Ages end, not through invasion or disaster from outside, but through what the people inside it chose to become. The decline did not begin on a specific day. There was no meeting at which the Elder of the High Golden Age voted to abandon the principles that had sustained their civilization and begin the descent that would end it. The process was slower than that, and quieter than that, and for much of its duration it did not look like a decline at all. It looked like a civilization enjoying what it had built. It looked like freedom. The gap between what it looked like and what it was deserves the slow attention that the pace of sleep allows, because the fall of the Elder is not primarily a story about violence, though violence is where it ends. It is primarily a story about what happens to a species over millennia when every structural constraint that shaped its behavior is removed at once, and when the particular psychic architecture of that species means that the consequences of removing those constraints do not stay contained within the individual or within the individual's immediate social environment. What happened to the Elder happened slowly, then catastrophically. Tonight, we follow the slow part. Complacency and the first loosening. The early phase of the Golden Age's transformation was not visible as corruption. It was visible as relaxation. A civilization that had spent centuries achieving dominance over the galaxy's other species, that had built its infrastructure and its paradise worlds and its webway gates and its psychomatons, arrived at a point where the work was done, where the machines ran themselves and the enemies had been defeated, and the world that existed was the world that the Eldar had intended to build. Complacency is the natural product of sufficient security sustained over a long enough time. A species that has not faced an existential threat for 1,000 years begins to forget what existential threats feel like. The habits of mind that vigilance produces atrophy when there is nothing to be vigilant about. The cultural practices that had encoded discipline and care and the management of the Eldar's particular psychic nature into the daily life of the civilization began to seem like artifacts of a time when such things were necessary, and the necessity had passed. The Eldar gods existed across this period. Asurian, the king of the gods, whose authority had once organized the Eldar's spiritual life. Isha, the goddess of the harvest, whose care for her people had expressed itself through the growth of living things. Vol, the smith god, whose craft had produced the artifacts that the Eldar's military tradition had been built around. Morai Heg the crone, whose wisdom carried the weight of what time produces. Cain the bloody-handed, whose nature expressed the Eldar's warrior tradition. Tegorach the laughing god, the trickster whose performances at the court of the young king had preserved the mythological cycles that were the Eldar's cultural memory. Lilith the maiden, whose domain was dreams and the future. These gods had been worshipped because the civilization that worshipped them had understood, at some level, that the gods represented principles rather than powers alone. Assyrian's authority was the principle of ordered hierarchy. Vor's craft was the principle of disciplined creation. Cain's blood was the principle that violence, when directed, served a purpose that random violence did not. As the Golden Age lengthened and complacency set in, the worship of the gods became less a genuine relationship with the principles they embodied, and more a cultural inheritance performed out of habit. The prayers that had once carried real psychological weight became ritual. The rituals became formality. The formality became, in time, the kind of thing that is done because it has always been done, not because anyone present understands why it was started. The first loosening was the loosening of the principle. The gods were still worshipped. The principles they encoded were no longer governing behavior in practice. The pleasure cults. Into the space that the loosened principles had vacated, the pleasure cults came. They did not emerge as a rebellion against the Eldar's traditions. They emerged as alternatives to those traditions, offerings of different ways to pursue the psychic intensity that the Eldar's nature demanded. If the old religious practices had provided one channel for that intensity, the pleasure cults provided others. They did not, at first, seem more dangerous than what they replaced. In some cases, in their early form, they were less dangerous because the old practices had their own rigidities and their own capacity for the kind of institutional corruption that rigid traditions develop when the original insight that motivated them has been forgotten. The pleasure cults were diverse. The lore preserves their variety in categories that give some sense of the range. Blood dancers, whose practice involved the aesthetics of controlled violence as a performance tradition. Body changers, whose relationship to the self extended to the physical alteration of the body through the Eldar's psychic and technological capabilities. Spirit walkers, half-corporeal beings who had pushed their relationship to the warp to the edge of what a material body could sustain. There were cults dedicated to esoteric knowledge, to the exploration of consciousness through means that the old religious traditions had not sanctioned, to the pursuit of sensation in every available form. Each cult offered intensity. The Eldar's psychic nature craved intensity in the way that a long unused sense craves stimulation. The Golden Age had provided material comfort and security, and the quiet pleasures of a civilization that had achieved what it set out to achieve. The pleasure cults provided something sharper, more immediate, more satisfying to the particular quality of Eldar consciousness that needed to feel things at full intensity to feel them at all. The Eldar gods were abandoned in favor of what the cults called personal deification through insane excess. The phrase is the lore's own, and it captures something important about the theological logic of what was happening. The gods represented external authority, structures of meaning that existed outside the individual and to which the individual was accountable. Personal deification was the inversion of this. The individual as their own ultimate authority, their own desire as the highest principle, the self as the measure of what was permissible. A civilization that had built its achievements on the principle of disciplined pursuit of collective goals was transforming, slowly, over millennia, into a collection of individuals each pursuing their own deification through their own chosen path of excess. The feedback loop. The mechanism that transformed personal excess into civilizational catastrophe was the feedback loop between Eldar consciousness and the warp. The entity that would become Slaanesh had been growing in the warp since the early Golden Age. Every Eldar desire, every Eldar experience of pleasure, every Eldar excess that the cults were pursuing, these were not discrete private events. They were psychic outputs from beings with psychic potential far beyond other races, and the warp received them the way a body of water receives rain. Each drop was small. The accumulated volume was not. Slaanesh, growing in the warp from the accumulated desire of the Eldar, did not grow passively. As it grew, it began to exert its own influence on the minds of the beings who were feeding it. The nascent dreams of the forming entity trickled back into Eldar consciousness and fueled their desires, pushing them toward greater excess, which fed the entity further, which increased its influence on Eldar consciousness, which produced greater excess. The feedback loop is the mechanism that transformed a slow decline into an accelerating one. The Eldar were not following their own desires alone toward increasingly extreme expression. They were also being influenced by the entity their desires were creating, the thing in the warp that was made of what they wanted, and that wanted more of what they were giving it. A seer's council might look at this and understand it. The apparatus for understanding what was happening in the warp existed within the Eldar tradition. The problem was that the apparatus required the kind of attention and discipline that the pleasure cults were, by definition, providing alternatives to. The seers who were paying attention were fewer in the Golden Age's later period than they had been in its earlier one. The practices that produced seers of sufficient capability to read the warp clearly had been losing adherents for centuries. The ones who remained were looking at something enormous and telling anyone who would listen, and fewer people were listening with each generation that passed. The escalation. The pleasure cults did not stay what they had been when they began. The mechanism of escalation is the same mechanism that makes the feedback loop work. What was sufficient yesterday produces less response today. A practice that produced genuine psychic intensity at one level of intensity becomes insufficient and requires more. The Eldar, whose psychic nature experienced things at greater depth than other species, experienced this escalation at greater speed and with greater consequences. The blood dancers, whose early performances had been about the controlled aesthetics of violence, became, across the centuries of the Golden Age's decline, something that control had left behind. The movement from the aesthetic to the actual, from the performance to the practice, from the representation of violence to the violence itself, did not happen overnight. It happened through the incremental logic of escalation, each step slightly beyond the previous one, each step feeling like a small expansion rather than a departure from what had come before. Sadistic killers began to stalk the streets of the Eldar homeworlds, not the blood dancers performing their aesthetic violence within a cultural framework that gave it a context. People whose relationship to violence had moved past any framework and who pursued it for the sensation it produced, which was the most intense sensation their particular escalation had found. Their victims were other Eldar. The distinction between practitioner and target, between the performer and the audience, had collapsed into something that had no ritual structure left to hold it. The Eldar homeworlds descended into anarchy, not in a single event, in the way that anarchy comes when the institutions that maintained order have been hollowed out over enough time that there is not enough structure left to hold the weight of what the population has become. The governance that had organized the Golden Age The councils and the hierarchies and the institutions whose function was to manage the collective life of a civilized species had been losing their grip for generations. New entities were being drawn into Eldar minds. The demons that the Eldar's psychic output had fed, the creatures of the warp that were the expressions of the excess that had been accumulating there, found increasingly easy access to Eldar consciousness as the barriers that Eldar discipline had maintained eroded. Individuals were possessed, then families, then whole sections of cities, then entire worlds fell to something that was not quite an invasion and not quite a collapse from within, but both at the same time, the external thing and the internal thing meeting and reinforcing each other. Brother fought brother. The lore uses this phrase, and it captures something that the more elaborate descriptions of the decline miss. The final stage of the Golden Age was not organized. It was not the pleasure cults conducting an ordered campaign against those who remained uncorrupted. It was the dissolution of the social bonds that had made the Eldar a people, rather than a collection of individuals, including the most fundamental bonds, the ones between family members. The warp storms. The warp registered what the Eldar were producing, not as policy or as punishment, but as physics, the immaterial dimension responding to the emotional output of the most psychically potent species that had ever lived, building toward the point where that output would coalesce into something that would change the warp structure permanently. For 10,000 years before the fall, the warp had been riven with storm and tempest, not the ordinary fluctuations that warp weather produced as a result of the galaxy's emotional currents. Something more sustained, more intense, more obviously the product of a specific concentrated source. The warp was building toward the birth of the thing the Eldar were feeding, and the building was visible as weather across the immaterial dimension. This had a consequence that the lore preserves with an irony that cuts across species and civilizations. The warp storms that surrounded Terra, the world that would become the seat of the human imperium, were a direct product of the Eldar's decline. The storms made warp travel massively unsafe across large portions of the galaxy. The Emperor of Mankind, who had been planning the Great Crusade that would reunite the scattered human worlds, could not launch it until the storms cleared. The storms cleared when the thing they had been building toward was born. The fall of the Eldar and the rise of the Imperium of Man are the same event, approached from different angles. The death of the galaxy's dominant species and the galactic diaspora of humanity's greatest military campaign were connected by the physics of the warp. The birth that destroyed the Eldar blew the storms away and gave the Emperor the window he needed. One civilization's ending made another's beginning possible. The Eldar who built the Craftworlds did not know this. They knew they were fleeing something. They did not know that their flight was clearing the path for the next dominant species to begin its own ascent. Tai, the Eldar who remained. As the decline entered its final phase, the homeworlds were not uniformly lost. Not all the Eldar of the late Golden Age had given themselves to the pleasure cults. Some had remained, watching, trying to turn their species from what it had become, trying to remind their kin of what the old traditions had been for and why the abandoning of them was not liberation, but a path towards something they would not survive. These Eldar failed to change the trajectory. The scale of what the civilization had become was too large for individual resistance to redirect. The feedback loop between Eldar excess and the growing entity in the warp was too advanced to interrupt from within. They were people who understood what was happening and could not do anything proportionate to the scale of the problem. What they could do was flee. The Craftworld builders, who had seen enough of what was forming in the warp to understand that the homeworlds would not survive whatever was building toward its birth, loaded their ships with everything that could be saved, the uncorrupted people who would come with them, the art and the plant life, and the animals, and the fragments of what the Eldar had been before the pleasure cults, the works of the old tradition that documented what the Eldar gods had represented, and why those representations had been worth maintaining. They left. In the law's own account, those who remained laughed at them, the Eldar of the late Golden Age, in the grip of the feedback loop and the accumulated cultural shift of centuries, found the people who were leaving to be fanatics or cowards, or people who had failed to understand that what the Eldar were becoming was an evolution rather than a corruption. The Craftworld builders took the laughter with them. They would carry it across the void, into the centuries of drift that followed the fall, into the grief of what they had escaped from and what they had not been able to save. The homeworlds were not going to save themselves. Sleep well. Tomorrow, the thing in the warp finishes what the Eldar built for it, and nothing in the galaxy is the same afterward. The last night of the Eldar homeworlds did not look different from the nights that had preceded it. That is the most important thing to understand about what happened, and the hardest to hold on to. The catastrophe was not signaled. There was no astronomical event, no omen that the Eldar seers could point to and say, "This is the night." The process that had been building for millennia was not operating on a schedule that anyone outside the entity forming in the warp had access to. The homeworlds were in the state the preceding centuries had produced. The pleasure cults were at the height of what they had become. The governance that had organized Eldar civilization had dissolved into the anarchy that the final generations of the decline had inhabited. The streets of the great cities of the Eldar Empire were the streets that the blood dancers and the sadistic killers had made of them. Places where the remnant of the greatest civilization the galaxy had seen was pursuing the particular version of intensity that the feedback loop had driven it toward. And in the warp, the thing that the Eldar's excess had been building across the centuries reached the threshold it had been approaching. It opened its eyes. What Slaanesh is. Before the event itself, the nature of what was born deserves a moment's attention, because Slaanesh is not the god of pleasure alone in the way that Khorne is the god of violence or Nurgle the god of decay. Slaanesh is the god of excess, the principle that more is always better, that satisfaction is a state to be exceeded rather than maintained, that the self is most expressed at full range in the pursuit of sensation past all limits. These are not evil principles in the way that cruelty is evil. They are the principles that exist in every living thing, and that, in the Eldar's case, had been cultivated to their most extreme expression over a period of thousands of years. Slaanesh was made of the Eldar, not as metaphor, in the sense that the substance of what the Chaos God is consists of the accumulated psychic output of the species that created it. The joy and the cruelty and the pleasure and the excess of 1 billion Eldar across a golden age of millennia are not raw material that went into making Slaanesh. They are Slaanesh given form and consciousness and the particular appetites that their combination produced. This is why Slaanesh's relationship to the Eldar is not the relationship of a predator to prey in the ordinary sense. Slaanesh is not interested in the Eldar as food, in the way that a creature hunts food. Slaanesh is specifically, actively, obsessively interested in the Eldar in the way that something is interested in what it is made of. The Eldar created their own god, and the god loves them with the particular love of something that was made from them, and will not release what it came from. No other creature of the warp had such a violent birth as Slaanesh. The lore preserves this assessment clearly. The chaos gods that preceded Slaanesh had grown from the emotional output of many species across many millennia, accumulating over time. Slaanesh emerged from the concentrated output of one species at the height of its excess, all at once, in the particular crescendo that the final depraved night produced. The birth scream. The moment of Slaanesh's emergence was felt across the galaxy, not as a military event or a physical disaster, not as something that equipment could detect, or that observers in real space could observe in the direct sense. As a psychic event, a wave of force radiating outward from the point of Slaanesh's birth in the warp, reaching everything that had any psychic presence in the galaxy, producing an effect proportionate to the psychic sensitivity of what it reached. For the Eldar on the homeworlds, there was not a single one who did not feel the pain. Every Eldar alive on those worlds in the moment of Slaanesh's birth felt the birth scream. The lore does not describe what this felt like from the inside, which is fitting, because what it produced was not a describable experience in the ordinary sense. The psychic cry of a chaos god's birth, directed by the nature of what that god was made of toward the species it was made from, is not something that the vocabulary of ordinary experience was built to contain. The spirits of the Eldar were drawn from their bodies. The phrasing is important. Not that the Eldar died and their spirits went to the warp. The process was the reverse. The spirits were drawn out first, pulled by the force of what was calling them home, and the bodies were left. On 100 Eldar worlds, on the homeworlds at the heart of the Empire, and on the colonies and the paradise worlds and the outpost settlements, the population fell, not all at once. The birth scream radiated at the speed of psychic propagation, which is not the speed of light and is not instantaneous. Worlds closer to the homeworlds felt it first. Worlds further away had fractions of time that were not time enough to do anything but feel what was coming from the worlds that had already been taken. The spirits that were drawn into the warp did not arrive in a neutral space. They arrived in Slaanesh's domain, in the dimension that the god had shaped as its home in the same moment of its birth. The fate of the spirits the lore describes as not pleasant. The entity that had been made from their excess received them with the particular attention that something gives to what it has been starving for and has now been given. The homeworlds were silent. The Eye of Terror. Where the birth occurred at the warp's interface with real space, the material dimension was not unchanged. The epicenter of the psychic implosion lay within the heart of the Eldar homeworlds, where the Eldar population had been most concentrated. The warp real space barrier, which the galaxy's ordinary physics maintained and which the chaos powers had always been pressing against, was torn open at the point where Slaanesh's birth produced the most force. The rift that opened was not small. An area almost 20,000 light-years across was engulfed in the substance of the warp, in the raw chaos that the material dimension is not equipped to contain. The Eye of Terror was not named yet in this moment, because the naming required people who had survived to see it from outside and to assign it a designation. It was the wound, the place in the galaxy's material structure where the barrier had failed and where what lay on the other side of that barrier was now accessible in both directions. The Eye of Terror is still there. In the 41st millennium of the Warhammer 40,000 universe, 10,000 years after the events of the Horus Heresy, and nearly 40,000 years after the fall itself, the Eye remains, an open wound almost 20,000 light-years across. The Eldar homeworlds that stood at its center when it opened still exist within it, transformed by the unmediated presence of the warp into something that the Eldar who survived the fall can't look at without understanding what they lost. The Eye of Terror is the scar of the fall. It persists across the entirety of the 40K timeline as a physical reminder, visible on star charts, meaningful to every spacefaring species that plots courses through the galaxy's northern sectors, that the most powerful civilization the galaxy has seen was also the most complete catastrophe. The Eldar gods. The Eldar were not the only thing Slaanesh consumed in the moment of the birth. The gods of the Eldar, the beings that the Eldar had worshipped during the Golden Age and had abandoned as the pleasure cults replaced the old traditions, existed as real entities in the warp, not metaphors or projections, real powers shaped by the Eldar's worship across millennia, with their own natures and their own investments in the species they had grown from. Slaanesh devoured them. The lore records the outcome of each. Lilith the Maiden, the goddess of dreams and prophecy, was consumed. Asurion, the king of the gods, whose authority had once organized the Eldar's spiritual hierarchy, was consumed. Moriheg the crone, whose wisdom the Eldar had sought across the generations of the Golden Age, was consumed. 3 escaped, or survived, or were taken rather than consumed, which is a different kind of outcome. Khan, the bloody-handed god, whose nature as the warrior god meant he fought rather than fled, did not submit to consumption passively. He fought Slaanesh in the warp, as a god fights another god, with everything that constituted him. He was not destroyed. He was shattered. The entity that had been Cain as a single coherent power was broken into fragments, pieces of a god distributed across the galaxy, each fragment lodging in one of the infinity circuits of the Craftworlds that had escaped the fall. The Eldar, who would later draw on Cain's power, who would become the warrior aspects that the Craftworld tradition developed, were drawing on splinters of a god that had refused to be consumed and been shattered for the refusal. Segorach, the laughing god, whose nature was trickery and whose domain included the webway, escaped through means that the lore presents with characteristic archness. How the laughing god escaped Slaanesh is not explained, because a god whose nature is the trick does not explain the trick. He escaped. He is still out there, in the webway, where the Harlequins who serve him perform the Eldar's mythological cycles in his name, and preserve the memory of what the Eldar were. Isha, the goddess of harvest and mercy, whose care for the Eldar had expressed itself through the cultivation of living things, was not consumed and did not escape. She was taken. Nurgle, the chaos god of decay and disease, encountered Isha in the moment of the catastrophe and claimed her before Slaanesh could consume her. What Nurgle's purpose in keeping her alive is, none of the surviving Eldar know. She is held in Nurgle's domain, tending to what she can. The lore preserves this detail as one of the fall's stranger outcomes. The goddess of harvest kept as a captive of the god of rot somewhere in the warp, unrescued. The Craftworlds that were caught. The ships that the Craftworld builders had made fled. The psionic shockwave propagated from the homeworlds outward, and the speed of its propagation was not the speed of light. Ships that had left early enough and travelled far enough before the birth scream reached them had a chance. Not all of them made it. Some Craftworlds were overtaken by the shockwave. The lore does not document which ones, because those that were overtaken are gone, and the Eldar who might have recorded them did not survive to do the recording. The Craftworlds that exist in the 41st millennium are the ones that escaped. The ones that did not escape are unknown, which is its own kind of accounting. The number of survivors tells you nothing about the number of those who tried to survive. Others were caught in a different way. The Eye of Terror, opening at the moment of the birth, exerted its own gravitational pull on ships in its vicinity. Some Craftworlds that had left in time to escape the birth screen were close enough to the homeworlds that the eye's opening caught them. They were pulled into orbit around the rift, trapped in proximity to the wound without being consumed by it. The lore records these as lost, Craftworlds that exist somewhere in the region of the eye, potentially intact, potentially populated, but unreachable by the Eldar, who drift further from the eye's edge in the ships that escape cleanly. The Craftworlds that survived the fall found themselves in a galaxy that had changed while they were fleeing. The warp storms that had raged around the galaxy for 10,000 years, the storms that had been the warp's weather during the Eldar decline, had cleared with the birth. Slaanesh's arrival had spent the energy that had been building in the warp toward the birth, and the immediate aftermath was a period of relative warp calm. The Emperor of Mankind, who had been watching for this opening, launched the Great Crusade. The surviving Eldar drifted in their ships through the remnants of what had been the greatest empire in the galaxy, through the cleared warp lanes that now bore human ships, moving in the opposite direction, toward the positions that the Empire of Man was claiming across the territory that the Eldar had once held. What was left? The catastrophe had not destroyed every Eldar alive. The Exodites, who had left earliest and settled furthest from the homeworlds, survived in greater numbers than any other Eldar group. Their world spirits, the psychic reservoirs that their maiden worlds maintained, had provided some protection from the birth screen. Their distance had provided more. They were diminished, and they were isolated, and they carried the knowledge of what had happened without the capacity to do anything proportionate to the scale of what they now knew. But they were alive. The Craftworld survivors were alive. Fewer than had been alive before the fall by orders of magnitude. The Eldar, who had been on the homeworlds, on the core worlds of the Empire, where the population had been most concentrated, were gone. What remained were the people who had read the signs and left, and the people who had been far enough away that the shockwave's reach had not been enough to take them. And in the webway, in the great mercantile city of Commorragh, and in the settlements that had grown up around the webway's junctions and passages, a population had survived that the fall had not reached in the way it reached the homeworlds. The webway's substance had insulated those within it from the worst of Slaanesh's psychic shockwave. The Eldar of Commorragh, who had been among the most enthusiastic participants in the pleasure cult's final excesses, found themselves alive in the aftermath of a catastrophe that their excess had produced, and that their location had protected them from surviving. They had watched it happen from inside the webway. They had felt it happen, as every living Eldar felt it. But the webway's walls had kept them from being drawn out as the homeworld populations had been drawn out. They were alive. They were in the dark of the webway, and the society they had been living in before the fall, the pleasure cults and the excess and the practices that had fed Slaanesh, was still the society they inhabited. They did not change. Or rather, they changed in the specific ways that people change when they survive something catastrophic, while remaining what they were before the catastrophe. The catastrophe becomes the new context within which the same patterns continue. What the fall had demonstrated was that Slaanesh was real and would take their souls at death. The response of Commorragh's survivors to this demonstration was not to become something different. It was to develop a method of staying alive. The galaxy they drifted through in their Craftworlds and their webway settlements and their maiden worlds was not the galaxy they had made. Someone else was inheriting it. Sleep well. Tomorrow, the survivors begin the long work of becoming the Eldar that the 41st millennium knows, and of carrying what they carry. The ships that escaped the fall were not empty of the fall's weight. They carried the people who had fled, the art and the animals and the cultural fragments, and everything that could be saved from a civilization that was being consumed behind them. They also carried the knowledge of what they had fled from. The seers who had built the Craftworlds had seen enough of what was forming in the warp to understand that the homeworlds would not survive whatever was building toward its birth. They had not known what would happen. They had known enough to leave. What they arrived at in the immediate aftermath of the fall was a galaxy changed in every way that mattered. The warp storms that had made travel difficult for 10,000 years had cleared. The Eye of Terror occupied the territory where the Eldar homeworlds had been, a wound in the galaxy's material structure 20,000 light-years across. The human ships of the nascent Imperium, freed by the storm's clearance to begin the Great Crusade, were moving through the lanes that had once been Eldar territory. The survivors were few. Not few in absolute terms, because the Eldar had been a vast civilization, and even the fraction that escaped was a significant population. But few relative to what had existed before, few relative to the scale of what had been lost, few in the way that the passengers of an ark are few when considered against the scale of the flood they escaped. They had to decide what to do with what they had survived with. The problem of the Eldar soul. The first and most urgent problem the Craftworld survivors faced was not military or political or cultural. It was theological and biological at once, which is a combination that tends to produce the most intractable problems a species can encounter. In the Golden Age, before the Fall, when an Eldar died, their soul returned to the warp. This had been the Eldar's afterlife. Not oblivion, not a distinct realm like the human concepts of heaven or the warp god's domains, but a return to the immaterial dimension that the Eldar had always maintained a particularly intimate relationship with. The soul was coherent enough in the warp to persist, and the Eldar of the Golden Age had believed, with the confidence of a civilization that had never encountered a threat it could not manage, that this persistence was the natural conclusion of an Eldar life. Slaanesh had changed this. The entity that had been made from the Eldar's excess was also made from the particular quality of the Eldar soul, which was the most intense and most coherent soul that any biological species in the galaxy produced. Slaanesh desired the Eldar with a specificity that extended to their afterlife as much as to their living selves. An Eldar soul released into the warp after death did not reach a neutral space where it could continue its existence. It was noticed. It was consumed. This was not a metaphorical consumption, not the absorption of a spirit into a greater whole, not the transformation of the soul into something else that might be considered a continuation. The consumption was the end of the Eldar who was consumed. Their individuality and their history and their particular way of inhabiting an Eldar consciousness dissolved into the hunger that had made itself from the accumulated hunger of their species. Every Eldar alive after the fall knew this. They knew it with the particular authority of people who had felt the birth scream and who understood, from the experience of feeling it, that Slaanesh was real and was oriented toward them in the way of something that had come from them and would not stop coming for them. The Golden Age's confidence that the warp was a safe destination for the Eldar soul was gone. The destination was the same. The entity waiting at the destination was new. The survivors needed a new afterlife. They needed to build one, under the specific constraints of their situation, at the edge of the galaxy, on ships that were vast but not infinite, with the resources and the knowledge that they had managed to bring with them. Wraithbone and the living ship. The Craftworlds were not ordinary ships. The technology that had built them predated the pleasure cults, predated the decline, predated everything the Golden Age had become at its worst. They had been built by the seers who saw what was coming, and who had poured the best of what the Eldar tradition had ever produced into the vessels that would carry the survivors. Wraithbone was the material, a psychoactive crystalline substance, the product of the Eldars' psychic tradition and their material sciences combined, which existed at the boundary between the physical and the psychic in a way that ordinary matter did not. Wraithbone responded to psychic input. It conducted psychic energy the way metal conducts electricity. It could be shaped by Eldar psychic manipulation, could be formed into structures that ordinary construction methods could not produce, could be integrated with the Eldar's own psychic presence in ways that blurred the distinction between the ship and its inhabitants. The Craftworlds were grown as much as they were built. The Eldar did not construct them the way human engineers construct ships, with assembly and fastening and the sequential addition of components to a predetermined structure. They shaped the Wraithbone the way a sculptor shapes clay, except that the clay was a psychoactive crystalline matrix, and the sculpting was performed through sustained psychic effort over the decades of the ship's creation. The ships that existed when the fall happened were the result of this effort, vast and living in the sense that their Wraithbone skeleton was suffused with the psychic presence of the people who had built them, and the people who lived in them, not conscious in the way a person is conscious, but responsive, oriented, structured around the ongoing relationship between the ship and its inhabitants in a way that made the Craftworld something different from a vessel that merely carried its passengers. The Wraithbone skeleton was also the foundation of what the survivors would build into it as their response to the problem of the Eldar soul. The Infinity Circuit. The Infinity Circuit was the afterlife that the Craftworld Eldar built inside their ships. The Wraithbone skeleton, which already conducted psychic energy throughout the ship, could also hold the psychic presence of an Eldar soul. Not hold it in the way a container holds water, which is a passive relationship. Hold it in the way a network holds a signal, preserving it, transmitting it, integrating it with the other signals in the network, allowing it to persist and even to participate in the ongoing life of the Craftworld in ways that the living could access. When an Eldar of the Craftworld tradition died, their soul was not released into the warp. It was captured. The spirit stone that each Craftworld Eldar wore, a gem-like object carried on the chest, acted as the vessel for the soul in the moment of death. The stone caught the soul before it could disperse into the warp, before Slaanesh's attention could reach it, and held it in a compressed and protected state. The stone was then brought to the Craftworld's Wraithbone core and integrated into the network. The soul it carried was released into the Infinity Circuit, into the psychocrystalline matrix that ran through the entire ship, where it could exist in a form of group consciousness alongside the other souls that the circuit held. The dead of the Craftworld. Every Eldar who had lived and died aboard it across the centuries since the fall were in the circuit, present, accessible, part of the accumulated mind that the ship had developed through the integration of its ancestors. The Eldar who died on a Craftworld did not, in the ordinary course of things, ceased to exist. They became part of the Craftworld. Their individual awareness diminished over time, merging with the broader presence of the circuit, but they were there. The living could consult them, could access the ancestral knowledge and experience that the circuit held, could draw on the psychic power of the accumulated dead to supplement their own. The Infinity Circuit was a solution to the problem of Slaanesh in the specific sense that it prevented consumption. A soul in the circuit was not in the warp. Slaanesh could not reach into a Wraithbone network. The dead were protected. The cost of this protection was that the dead were also bound. Not bound in a way that felt like constraint from the inside, at least not immediately. Bound in the sense that the circuit was the entirety of what was available to them. The Eldar afterlife had once been the warp, a vast immaterial dimension whose scale matched the scale of the civilization that had inhabited it. The Craftworld afterlife was the ship, vast by the standards of what ships were, but not vast in the way the warp had been vast. Iyanden, one of the greatest of the surviving Craftworlds, developed the first known Infinity Circuit, recovering spirit stones from those who had died during the fall itself, and integrating them into the ship's Wraithbone structure. This knowledge spread across the other Craftworlds by the 34th millennium. The technique that Iyanden pioneered became the foundation of the Craftworld tradition's relationship to death. The Spirit Stone. The Spirit Stone, which the Eldar also called a Waystone or in myth, the Tears of Isha, was the mechanism that made the Infinity Circuit possible. Without the Spirit Stone, the Eldar soul's passage from life to the circuit would have required direct transfer at the moment of death, which was not survivable as a process. The soul would disperse into the warp in the interval before it could be caught by the circuit's psychic matrix. The Spirit Stone caught it first. The stone was not a passive object. It had a psychic affinity for the soul of the Eldar who wore it, developed through contact and through the particular bond that psychoactive materials form with the psychic presences they spend years in contact with. When the Eldar died, the stone's affinity pulled the departing soul into its crystalline matrix, holding it in the compressed and protected state that the stone maintained until it could be brought to the circuit. To lose the Spirit Stone at the moment of death was to lose the soul entirely. The stone removed from a dying Eldar's chest felt to the body, the law records, as torture, and the soul thus exposed would cry out to the warp, calling any nearby demons to what was now an unprotected and detectable presence. This was not an injury alone. It was the complete and irreversible loss of the Eldar who wore the stone, their consciousness and their history and their accumulated experience consumed by Slaanesh in the moment the stone's protection was removed. This gave the Spirit Stone a significance that extended beyond the individual who wore it. The stone was the Eldar's insurance against the thing that waited for them. Every Eldar Craftworlder carried one. The cultural weight of the stone was not comparable to human jewelry, or even to human religious artifacts. It was the most practically significant object an Eldar could own. The difference between death as a transition to a new state and death as absolute consumption. The destruction of another Eldar Spirit Stone was among the worst acts the Craftworld tradition recognized. It was not murder, because the body might survive the stone's destruction. It was worse than murder, in the accounting of a culture that had made the protection of souls from Slaanesh the center of its social ethics. The pass system. The Craftworld Eldar did not only replace the Golden Age's afterlife mechanics and consider themselves safe. The fall had been produced by the excess of the Eldar psyche, by the unmanaged intensity of a species that experienced everything at greater depth than other races and had, over millennia, pursued that depth into the territory that created Slaanesh. To survive, the Craftworld tradition needed to address the source of the problem, not only its consequences. The Infinity Circuit protected the dead from Slaanesh. The Path system was the protection of the living. The Path was the Craftworld's answer to the fundamental problem of what it meant to be Eldar. An Eldar whose psychic intensity could make every experience overwhelming, whose connection to the warp broadcast every desire into the immaterial dimension where Slaanesh waited for this kind of signal, could not live safely the way the Golden Age's Eldar had lived. The Golden Age had been the demonstration of what unmanaged Eldar desire produced over a long enough time. The Craftworlds could not permit a repetition. The Path system was discipline institutionalized. The principle was that an Eldar walked one path at a time, focusing their psychic intensity on a single skill or vocation to the exclusion of all others, mastering it over years or decades, and then moving on to the next path when the mastery was complete. A warrior who walked the path of the warrior directed everything their Eldar nature could produce toward the specific practice of combat, becoming over the years of their path one of the most capable fighters any race in the galaxy could produce. An artist who walked the path of the dreamer directed that same intensity toward creation. The focus was the protection. An Eldar on a path was not in the undirected state that the Golden Age had produced, the state where desire, having no specific object, accumulated and escalated and fed the entity in the warp. An Eldar on a path was directing their psychic intensity toward a specific end, consuming it productively rather than letting it accumulate. The danger was in the transition between paths, in the periods when the previous path had been completed and the next had not yet been taken, and in the particular psychic state called the lost. Eldar who were lost had walked too far into a single path, had become so immersed in it that they could not step back out. A warrior who became lost on the path of the warrior became an exarch, a permanent warrior whose identity had merged with the path beyond the possibility of disengagement. An Eldar who became lost in a less structured way became something the Craftworld tradition regarded with a grief that combined sorrow and fear. The exarchs were not tragedies in the way that the lost were tragedies. They were recognized, their role within the warrior tradition honored, their permanent state understood as the cost of the depth that path focus produced at its most extreme. But they were also the demonstration that the path system's protection was not absolute. The intensity that made the Eldar what they were could not be contained. It could be directed. Direction was not the same as safety. The Wraithguard and the necromancy of need. The Infinity Circuit held the dead. It also produced a resource that the Craftworld tradition used with extreme reluctance and considered a practice that bordered on the forbidden. In times of great need, when the Craftworld's living defenders were insufficient for what was being asked of them, the dead could be retrieved. A spirit stone holding a specific soul could be removed from the circuit. The soul could be drawn back from the group consciousness into a more individual state, and the stone could be placed into an artificial construct of wraithbone built to house it. The soul thus placed experienced reality through the construct's senses, piloting it, fighting through it, defending the craft world it had once lived on through the body of a Wraithguard or a Wraith Lord. The lore describes the experience as a dream. The soul's awareness of reality through the construct was attenuated, filtered through materials and psychic connections that were not the biological body the soul had spent its life in. The dead who were retrieved from the circuit and placed into Wraith constructs were fighting in a state that was not quite waking, not quite sleep. Their agency real, but their perception of what they were doing shaped by the distance between the construct's sensors and the direct experience of embodied consciousness. This was why the Craftworld tradition called the practice a form of necromancy and restricted it to moments of genuine emergency. The spirit seers, the warlocks, who specialized in communicating with the Infinity Circuit and managing the integration of the dead, were the custodians of this power, and the ones who determined when the need was sufficient to justify disturbing the dead's rest. The Craftworlds that had lost large portions of their living population in the battles of the 41st millennium, most notably Eandon, which had been devastated by the Tyrannid Hive Fleet Kraken, found the ratio of dead to living on their ships tilting in ways that the tradition had not anticipated. Vast sections of Eandon's internal spaces were inhabited by Wraithguard, the ancestral dead walking the halls of their home in their constructed bodies, holding councils the living did not attend, defending a Craftworld whose living population could not have defended it alone. The tradition that had been reserved for emergencies had become, for Eandon, a condition of existence. The drift and the long wait. The Craftworlds moved through the galaxy on paths determined by necessity and by the long view that Farseers developed across centuries of practice. The Farseers, the most psychically powerful of the Craftworld Eldar, whose mastery of the path of the seer gave them the capacity to read the trajectories of fate and to identify the paths that led toward the outcomes the Craftworld needed, directed the ships with the patience of beings who understood that the galaxy's timescale was not the timescale of a human lifetime. A Farseer might plan across centuries, might seed the conditions for an outcome that their successors would not see achieved for generations, might engage with a situation on the other side of the galaxy, not because it was relevant to the current generation's immediate concerns, but because its resolution, 300 years later, would affect the Craftworld's survival in ways that the immediate situation did not make visible. This quality of patience was one of the things that made the Craftworld Eldar alien to the other species they encountered, including the humans of the Imperium. A negotiation with an Eldar Farseer was a negotiation with someone whose assessment of the relevant time frame extended back and forward from the current moment by centuries. A battle against Craftworld forces might be an engagement that the Eldar had been positioning for across decades. The immediate military event only the last step of a strategy so long in its development that the opponents had no way to reconstruct what they were part of. The Craftworlds were not at war with the galaxy. They were not trying to reclaim the Eldar Empire or rebuild what the fall had destroyed. They were trying to survive. The distinction shaped everything about how they engaged with the world around them. An engagement with a human planet, a confrontation with an Orc War, a raid against a Necron tomb complex. These were not expressions of Eldar ambition or Eldar aggression in the way that a human empire's military campaigns expressed human ambition. They were moves in the long game of keeping the ships moving, keeping the Infinity Circuits intact, keeping the few Eldar alive until the situation changed in whatever direction the Farseers had identified as survivable. The Eldar who had built the galaxy's greatest empire were now managing its wreckage. Not with despair, because despair was one of the states the path system was designed to prevent, with a particular quality of determination that comes from having no acceptable alternative to continued effort. Sleep well. Tomorrow, the Dark Eldar of Commorragh, who chose a different path through the same catastrophe and have been paying for it differently and have never stopped. The Craftworld survivors chose discipline. They built the path system and the Infinity Circuit and the Spirit Stones and the long patience of the Farseers' planning, and they directed the psychic intensity of the Eldar nature into channels that the civilization's experience had demonstrated were necessary rather than merely convenient. The fall had taught them what unmanaged desire produced. They managed it. The Drukhari, the Dark Eldar of Commorragh, did not make this choice, or rather, they made a different one. In the immediate aftermath of the fall, the survivors of the webway's interior had two pieces of knowledge available to them. The first was that Slaanesh existed and was hungry for Eldar souls, and would claim those souls at death if they were not protected by means that had not previously been necessary. The second was that the excess that had created Slaanesh was still possible, still something they could continue, and that the particular psychic intensity of Eldar experience was still available to them, as it had been before. The Craftworld tradition concluded that the second piece of knowledge made the continuation of excess too dangerous. The Drukhari concluded something different. They found that the suffering of others, absorbed as psychic nourishment, could substitute for the slow consumption of their own souls by Slaanesh. That the entity that had been made from Eldar desire could be fed from the outside rather than from within. That if you could force the pain and terror and suffering of another being through the mechanism that the Eldar's psychic sensitivity provided, the resulting psychic energy would sustain you in the way that the Golden Age's pleasures had sustained the pre-fall Eldar, but without the accumulation that had produced the fall in the first place. They were right. The mechanism worked. It is still working in the 41st millennium, in the Dark City that has expanded and contracted and survived wars and invasions and internal catastrophes across the tens of thousands of years since the fall. The Drukhari are alive and functional and conducting their raids into real space because the mechanism they discovered in the aftermath of the fall has sustained them across the intervening time. It requires feeding, not occasionally, constantly. Commorragh. The city existed before the fall. This is one of the less appreciated facts about Commorragh's relationship to the catastrophe that produced the Drukhari. The Dark City was not built as a response to the fall. It was built during the Golden Age as one of the great mercantile ports of the Webway, a place where the Eldar's dominion over the Webway's network had produced a trading hub of enormous scale. The Webway, the network of subspace tunnels that the Eldar had built and maintained, and that allowed travel across the galaxy without exposure to the warp, was not a transit network alone. It was a space, and spaces accumulate things. Commorragh had accumulated the merchant traffic that moved through its gates, the infrastructure that merchant traffic requires, the population that infrastructure supports, the culture that a large and prosperous population generates across the centuries. By the late Golden Age, Commorragh was one of the Eldar's largest cities. It was also one of the most thoroughly immersed in the pleasure cults. The mercantile culture that had originally organized the city had produced, over centuries of prosperity, the particular variant of excess that wealthy trading ports tend to produce. The excess of people who have enough and want more, who have access to the products of the galaxy and the means to acquire the most extreme versions of those products, who have developed the aesthetic vocabulary of decadence in a context where decadence was available and affordable to most of the population. The Webway's substance had insulated the city's inhabitants from the worst of Slaanesh's birth scream. Not entirely. Every Eldar alive in the Webway felt what happened, felt the pulling toward what had been born. But the Webway was not the warp, and the mechanisms of the birth scream's propagation were attenuated by the Webway's properties in a way that left the city's population alive and, if reduced and damaged, functional. They found themselves alive in the aftermath of the worst catastrophe their species had experienced. The homeworlds were gone. The Eye of Terror occupied the territory where the Eldar Empire had been. The Craftworld survivors were drifting through space. And Commorragh, in the dark of the webway, was still standing. The discovery. The discovery that sustained the Drukhari was not made through deliberate research. It was made through the continuation of the practices that had characterized the late Golden Age's culture. The practices that had fed Slaanesh, that had contributed to the accumulation of psychic output that had built the entity that now waited for their souls. In the aftermath of the fall, the survivors of Commorragh were diminished. Slaanesh's birth had taken something from every Eldar who survived it, a portion of the psychic presence that made them what they were, a diminishment that the webway's protection had reduced but not prevented. The Drukhari who lived in the immediate post-fall period were experiencing their existence at less than the intensity that Eldar existence required, which, for a species whose psychic nature was the foundation of everything, they were meant to be experiencing a kind of deficiency that had no obvious remedy. The experience of inflicting extreme suffering on other beings produced something. The psychic energy released by a sentient creature in acute pain or terror, passing through the Drukhari's psychic sensitivity, was processed by the body and the soul in a way that the Eldar's particular psychic architecture was equipped to receive. It was not the same as what the Golden Age had provided. The quality was different, but it replenished what Slaanesh had taken. It sustained what the diminishment had reduced. It allowed the survivors to function at something approaching the intensity that Eldar consciousness required. The surplus, the energy not needed to maintain baseline function, went somewhere. It made the Drukhari who fed regularly younger in a way that the normal passage of Eldar biology did not produce. A Drukhari who had recently fed on the suffering of captives shone with a cold and startling physical vitality, their appearance restored to the standard of biological youth, even as the millennia continued to pass. A Drukhari who had not fed recently became a shadow of that appearance, aged, reduced, desperately seeking the next source of what they needed. The mechanism made them, under certain conditions, functionally immortal, not unconditionally. A Drukhari who could not feed would age and die as surely as any biological creature. But a Drukhari who fed regularly had no inherent limit on how long they could continue feeding, and therefore continue existing. The oldest inhabitants of Commorragh, the highborn who had survived the fall itself, and who had been feeding across the tens of thousands of years since, were the oldest living Eldar anywhere in the galaxy, their individual experience of existence spanning a time frame that made even the Craftworld's long-planning farces look recent by comparison. The city that feeds. Commorragh grew. The immediate aftermath of the fall was a period of contraction. The city's supply lines had been disrupted by the catastrophe. Many of its inhabitants had been killed by the birth scream's attenuated reach, and the webway around it had been significantly damaged by the violence of what had torn the Eye of Terror open. The mercantile traffic that had once moved through Commorragh's gates had ceased, because the empire that had generated that traffic was gone. The Drukhari, who remained rebuilt, what remained with the particular pragmatism of people who have survived the worst thing they can imagine, and who understand that survival has a specific cost and a specific mechanism. The cost was that other beings would suffer. The mechanism was raiding. They went into real space through the webway's hidden portals. The webway connected to the wider galaxy through gates, some of which were known and maintained, and some of which were concealed or forgotten until a Drukhari with sufficient knowledge of the webway's architecture could find them. Through these gates, the Drukhari could emerge into real space at points distributed across the galaxy, conduct raids with the speed that the webway's transit capacity allowed, and return to Commorragh with captives before the populations they raided could mount an effective response. The speed was the point. Commorragh, in the webway, had no fixed position in real space, no location that could be plotted on a map and approached by an enemy. The portals it accessed were distributed, numerous, and recoverable in the sense that a closed portal could be reopened by someone with the knowledge to reopen it. The raids that emerged from those portals could strike anywhere in the galaxy and be gone before the target could mount a response. The victim of a Drukhari raid looked at a gap in their population's census and found no trace of where the missing had gone, because the direction they had gone was a direction that real space maps did not record. The captives were brought to Commorragh. The suffering they could be made to produce in the city's arenas and torture chambers and pleasure palaces was the resource that sustained the population. The duration of that suffering was a quality. A Drukhari who understood their craft could extend the process long past the point where less skilled practitioners would have produced a corpse, drawing out the available psychic nourishment across days or weeks, rather than consuming it in a single event. This was why the Drukhari's expertise in the techniques of torture was not incidental to their culture, but central to it. Their understanding of biology, of psychology, of the mechanisms by which the body and mind produced the particular signals that translated into the psychic nourishment the Drukhari required, was the foundation of their survival. The expertise was developed across millennia of practice, accumulated in the living tradition of the city in the way that any craft is accumulated when the practitioners have indefinite time to refine it. The structure of the Dark City. Commorragh was not one city. It was several cities, built and expanded and absorbed into each other across the tens of thousands of years since the fall, each addition reflecting the political history of the Drukhari and the particular character of the highborn who had controlled the expansion. The cabals were the dominant political structure. The highborn families who had survived the fall and who had accumulated the resources and the followers and the influence to become the city's ruling class, organized themselves into cabals. Networks of power built around a lord or lady of sufficient capability to hold the network together against the competitive pressure of the other cabals. The competition between cabals was continuous and often violent, conducted through the assassinations and raids and political maneuvering that the Drukhari's culture had developed as the expression of the ambition that the Eldar's psychic nature would have directed elsewhere in a different context. Above the Cabal system, theoretically, sat Asdrubal Vecht, the supreme overlord of Commorragh, the architect of the political order that had replaced the chaos of the post-fall city, with a system that was still brutal, but was at least consistent in its brutality. Vecht was the figure whose influence on the Drukhari as a whole exceeded that of any other individual in their history. He was not born high. He had made himself what he became through the particular combination of patience and capability and willingness to do whatever was necessary that the Drukhari's environment rewarded most reliably. He was also among the oldest Drukhari living, which meant he had been feeding and accumulating for longer than the institutions of most other civilizations had existed. His experience of the webway, of Commorragh's internal politics, of the real space galaxy and its various populations and their vulnerabilities, was a resource that 10,000 years of active engagement had built to a degree that no shorter-lived individual could match. He had coined the term that the Drukhari used for themselves. He had called himself Eladrith Ineus in the 32nd millennium, and the name had spread, and it was from him that the designation Dark Eldar entered the wider galaxy's vocabulary. The naming was itself a political act, the Supreme Overlord choosing to openly define what his people were, rather than allowing others to define them. The homunculi. The Cabals were not the only power structure in Commorragh. The covens of the homunculi occupied a different position in the city's political ecology, one that the Cabals needed and resented in about equal measure. The homunculi were the practitioners of the Drukhari's medical tradition, which was not medicine in the sense that the word carries in cultures oriented toward the preservation and restoration of health. It was the expertise that feeding required at its most sophisticated, the complete understanding of how biological and psychic suffering was produced, maintained, and extended, applied with the precision that millennia of practice in an environment where the expertise was the most valuable thing a Drukhari could possess had produced. They could also do other things. The homunculi's understanding of flesh and bone and psychic architecture extended to the ability to rebuild beings that had been reduced to pieces, to create new forms that had not existed naturally, to preserve and restore and alter the bodies of those who could pay for the service. The Drukhari, who died in the constant internal violence of Commorragh's political environment, could be brought to a homunculus for reconstruction if the arrangements had been made in advance and the price was acceptable. This made the homunculi politically significant in a way that was separate from their role as the city's experts in suffering. They controlled access to the kind of continuity of existence that the Drukhari's environment made precarious. A highborn, who had the right relationships with the right homunculus coven, had an insurance against the deaths that Commorragh's violence regularly produced. A highborn without such relationships was playing Drukhari politics without a safety net. The homunculi themselves were almost uniformly ancient. The oldest were among the oldest beings in the galaxy, individuals who had been practicing their expertise since before the Great Crusade, who had accumulated such depth of understanding across such a time frame that their capabilities exceeded what any individual's natural span of experience could produce. They were not interested in power in the way the Cabal lords were interested in power. They were interested in their work, in the refinement of what they did, in the particular satisfaction of a tradition extended and deepened across time. What the Drukhari carry. The Drukhari are not the elder of the Golden Age. They cannot be, because the Golden Age ended, and the species that had inhabited it was reduced and transformed by what ended it. But they are a continuation of the Elder in the specific sense that the characteristics the old ones built into the species are still present in them. The psychic sensitivity, the depth of experience, the particular quality of a consciousness that processes everything at a pitch that other races' vocabulary was not built to describe. What they have done with these characteristics in the tens of thousands of years since the fall is not what the Craftworld tradition has done with them. The path system's discipline, the infinity circuit's protection, the long planning of the Farseers, none of these are present in Commorragh. The path the Drukhari chose was not the path of discipline, but the path of substitution, not the management of desire, but the redirection of desire toward a target that could absorb its expression without the accumulation that had destroyed the empire. They have not stopped being what Eldar are. They have not moderated the intensity, have not developed the containment systems that the Craftworld tradition built to protect the galaxy from the intensity's consequences. They have instead developed a city and a culture and a set of practices that direct the intensity outward toward the suffering of beings who are not Eldar, and that extract from that suffering the nourishment that sustains them. The consequence is that Commorragh requires the rest of the galaxy to sustain it, The raiders who go out through the webway's portals are not conducting a military campaign or pursuing a political objective. They are doing what farmers do when they go to the fields, gathering what the population requires to continue. The difference is what is being gathered and what it costs the gathered. A Drukhari who is recently fed is beautiful in the specific way that the Eldar's aesthetics have always produced beauty. The physical appearance maintained at the pitch that Eldar biology is capable of. The senses operating at the intensity that the Eldar's psychic nature allows. The experience of existence at the quality that the species was built to have. A Drukhari who is not fed is a diminishment of all these things. The beauty failing, the senses dulling, the experience of existence narrowing towards something that, for a being whose nature requires intensity, feels like dying. The choice between feeding and not feeding is, for the Drukhari, the choice between being what they are and ceasing to be it. Their entire civilization, its politics and its traditions, and its extraordinary expertise in the techniques of what sustains it, is the civilization of beings who have chosen to be what they are at the price that being it requires. The galaxy's other species, the humans and the orcs, and the countless races that the Drukhari's raids take from, are paying that price without having agreed to pay it. The Drukhari's continued existence is funded by the suffering of everyone else. Sleep well. Tomorrow, the Harlequins and the Laughing God, who kept the old dances alive through everything, and the Exodites on their distant worlds, and what remains of the Eldar gods. 3 groups survived the fall in ways that differed from both the Craftworld tradition and the Drukhari of Commorragh. The Exodites, who had left earliest and settled furthest from the homeworlds, on the wild maiden worlds at the galaxy's edges. The Harlequins, who served a god that the fall had not been able to consume. And in the infinity circuits of every craft world, in the accumulated dead of tens of thousands of years of Eldar history, something was forming that none of the surviving Eldar had designed or planned. Tonight we follow all 3. Commorragh and the escape. The Laughing God survived. His survival, unlike the survival of the Craftworld Eldar or the Drukhari, was not a matter of preparation or positioning or the happy accident of being in a protected space when the catastrophe struck. It was a matter of what he was by nature. Commorragh's nature, the quality that had made him the Eldar's trickster god and the patron of mocking and irony and the particular kind of wisdom that laughs at what it cannot change, had insulated him from the accumulated decadence that fed Slaanesh. The logic is precise. The pleasure cults of the late Golden Age had fed Slaanesh through the excess of Eldar desire, which is to say, through the excess of Eldar taking themselves and their own pleasure seriously. The deepest expression of the Eldar's psychic intensity turned inward and treated as the highest value had produced the entity that consumed their gods and their homeworlds. Commorragh's nature, which found the seriousness with which beings treated themselves and their own importance to be the root of most tragedies, had never been absorbed into the feedback loop that destroyed the others. He escaped into the webway. The account the law preserves is characteristically indirect. While Slaanesh was occupied fighting Cain, whose resistance had bought the Eldar time to flee on their craft worlds, Commorragh used the distraction to slip away into the webway's labyrinthine tunnels. Not through force, not through a confrontation that his power could not have won, but through the method that his nature had always preferred, the side door, taken while the dangerous thing was looking at something else. He is still in the webway. The Laughing God of the Eldar inhabits the same network that the Drukhari use for their raids, and that the Craftworld Eldar navigate in their maintained vessels. and that the Harlequins traverse in their distinctive craft. He is there somewhere, in the webway's interior, where the god he cannot fight cannot reach him. The lore notes that he is mocking, sinister, vindictive, and enigmatic, and that his pranks and jokes punish gods and mortals alike for the sin of pride. He had punished the Eldar for that sin, in his own way, long before the fall. The mythology he had maintained through the Harlequins had been a reminder, across the Golden Age's centuries, that the civilization's pride in its own achievement was the source of the thing that would destroy it. Nobody had listened. The fall had happened anyway. Commorragh, who had been the warning and the reminder and the voice that laughed at what could not be changed, found himself in the aftermath of the catastrophe still laughing, though the laughter was of a different quality than it had been. The Harlequins. The Harlequins were Commorragh's people before the fall, and they are his people after it, the practitioners of the performance tradition that the Eldar's artistic culture had developed into its most sophisticated form, who had during the Golden Age maintained the mythological cycles that encoded the Eldar's understanding of their gods and their history, found in the aftermath of the fall that the role they had served during the decline had become the most important role any Eldar could occupy. The fall had destroyed the institutions through which the Eldar's cultural memory was normally transmitted. The homeworlds were gone. The great libraries and archives were in the eye of terror or worse. The oral traditions that had preserved the mythology cycles across the Golden Age's centuries were disrupted and fragmented by the catastrophe and its aftermath. The survivors of the fall, distributed across Craftworlds and the Webway and the Exodite worlds, had access to different fragments of the tradition and no longer the common ground of a civilization that assumed shared knowledge. The Harlequins travelled between all these groups. The webway that had been the Eldar's transit network before the fall was still navigable, if damaged, and the Harlequins' craft could move through it in ways that allowed them to reach every surviving Eldar community. Craftworld to Craftworld, Craftworld to Exodite world, into the edges of Commorragh. The Harlequins brought performances to these communities, and the performances were not entertainment in the way that Golden Age performances had been entertainment. They were cultural transmission. The Dance Without End, the Harlequins' theatrical retelling of the fall and of the mythological history that preceded it, was the Eldar's surviving civilization passing its own memory across the populations that had survived the catastrophe. Each Harlequin troop maintained a complete version of the dance. The troop's leader, the Great Harlequin, held the full mythological cycle in memory and performance, training the troop's other members in their roles. When a troop member died, the role was trained into the next, the continuity preserved through the living tradition of the performance, rather than through the archives that no longer existed. The Harlequins' protection from Slaanesh was different from both the Spirit Stone and the Drukhari mechanism. The lore states that those who follow Commorragh seem to live without fear for their souls. The god they serve, who had survived the fall through the particular quality of his nature, extended some version of that protection to those who served him. The mechanism is not explained with the detail that the Craftworld tradition's mechanisms are explained, because the Laughing God's operations do not tend to involve documentation. What is visible is the outcome. Harlequins die in battle, as performers who also fight die when the fighting goes wrong, and their souls do not go to the Infinity Circuit, and do not appear to feed Slaanesh in the way that unprotected Eldar souls feed her. Where they go is Commorragh's knowledge, and not anyone else's, which is a distribution of information characteristic of a trickster god. They did not only preserve mythology, The Harlequins also maintained a relationship to a location within the webway that no other Eldar faction could access or perhaps even locate. The Black Library, the repository of knowledge about chaos that the Eldars' long history of engagement with the warp and its powers had produced. The most complete record of what chaos was, how it worked, what its weaknesses were, and how it might be confronted existed in the Black Library, and the Harlequins guarded access to it with the particular attention of beings who understood that the knowledge inside it was the most dangerous thing the Eldar tradition had ever assembled. The Exodites and the Maiden Worlds. The Exodites had left before the Golden Age's final stage, not because they had specifically anticipated the fall with the precision of the Craftworld builders, but because what they saw happening in the Eldar's civilization in the centuries before the fall was already more than they were willing to remain part of. The worlds they settled were called Maiden Worlds, uninhabited or previously uninhabited by the Eldar, ecologically complex in the way of worlds that had not been altered by the industrial demands of a technologically sophisticated civilization. The Exodites chose these worlds for what they required rather than for what they offered. Places where the labor-saving technology of the Golden Age was not available, where the physical demands of existence were present, where the management of desire that the Golden Age had made optional was enforced by the simple need to survive. They brought some technology with them, not the psychometons and spirit drones that had replaced physical labor in the Golden Age. The technological tradition they maintained was shaped by what the Eldar had developed before the pleasure cults had redirected the civilization's energy. Weapons, agricultural techniques that worked with the natural systems of the Maiden Worlds rather than overriding them. The knowledge of Wraithbone and the psychic traditions that underpinned the Eldar's core capabilities. What they built was different from both the Craftworld and the Drukhari models, where the Craftworld tradition maintained the urban and technological sophistication of the Eldar in a mobile context, and where Commorragh maintained a dark mirror of the Golden Age's cityscape in the webway's interior. The Exodites built something that looked, from outside, more like the settlements that the Eldar's mythology placed at the beginning of their history. Communities integrated with the ecosystems of their worlds, dependent on those ecosystems, rather than on the maintenance of complex technology. The Eldar gods of the Exodites were the world spirits. The Maiden Worlds had planetary spirits, the accumulated psychic resonance of the world's living ecology that the Exodites had developed a relationship with over the centuries since settlement. When an Exodite died, their soul did not go to an infinity circuit. It went to the world spirit, the psychic presence of the world they had lived on, and was absorbed into the world's collective memory in the way that the Craftworld's dead were absorbed into the infinity circuit's collective consciousness. The protection from Slaanesh was the world spirit's psychic density. A soul absorbed into a world spirit was not floating free in the warp where Slaanesh could reach it. It was integrated into a complex psychic system that was as old as the world itself, held within a matrix that the natural ecology of a living planet maintained, and that had a stability that no artificial construct could quite replicate. The Exodites were, of all the Eldar's surviving groups, the most protected from Slaanesh by the mechanism of their afterlife. The cost was the investment. The Exodites had committed themselves to their worlds in a way that the Craftworld Eldar had not committed themselves to their ships. The Craftworld could move, the Maiden World could not. An Exodite community whose world was threatened by the various dangers of the 41st millennium's galaxy was not able to leave, not able to pull up the roots they had put down across the generations of settlement. They fought for their worlds with the intensity that any people fights for the place their ancestors are buried, with the knowledge that losing was not only a military defeat, but the destruction of everything the community had built its identity around. Cain shattered. Before continuing to the new god forming in the dark, the fate of Cain the Bloody-Handed deserves the specific attention the lore gives it, because Cain's survival was not the survival of a god intact and functional. It was the survival of a god in fragments, and what the fragments do in the 41st millennium is one of the stranger aspects of the Eldar's religious life. When Slaanesh emerged and began consuming the Eldar gods, Cain fought. His nature was that of a warrior god, the Eldar's divine expression of the martial tradition, and the response to a threat for Cain was always to meet it without delay. He did not flee through the webway. He did not allow himself to be consumed. He turned and fought Slaanesh in the warp, the god of excess and desire meeting the god of war, and the conflict was fierce enough that Khorne, the chaos god of blood and skulls, whose own nature brought him into opposition with Slaanesh, was drawn into the confrontation. The conflict exhausted all three. When the boundaries of their conflict had been established and the immediate intensity had spent itself, Cain had not been consumed. He had been shattered. The being that had been a coherent divine entity was broken into fragments, each fragment scattered into the material world, and the fragments came to rest in the wraithbone cores of the Craftworlds that had escaped the fall. Each Craftworld that carries a fragment of Cain carries an avatar. The bloody-handed god's presence, reduced to the single fragment the Craftworld holds, can be activated in times of war. A living Eldar performs the ritual that wakes the fragment, sacrificing themselves to it, and what rises from the wraithbone is not Cain restored, but an expression of Cain as concentrated through the fragment and the sacrifice. The avatar fights as a god engine, a burning presence of destruction on the battlefield, almost impossible to permanently destroy, because what animates it is a fragment of a divine being, rather than a mortal soul. The lore preserves an important note about the nature of Cain's shattering. Neither Khorne nor Slaanesh could find his entirety after the fragmentation. The reason given is that Cain is something so fundamental to the Eldar's nature that no Chaos God could consume him in his entirety. The warrior spirit of the species that the Old Ones built as weapons survived the destruction of the civilization that had expressed it by dispersing into the material fabric of the Craftworlds themselves. Cain did not survive intact. He became something distributed and reduced, present in fragments rather than as a whole. But he was not consumed. Arcuri Inead, forming. In the infinity circuits of every surviving Craftworld, among the accumulated dead of tens of thousands of years, something has been forming that none of the Eldar designed. The Eldar have a god of the dead, or rather, they have the beginning of one. Inead, whose name the Eldar give to this forming presence, is the nascent deity that the accumulated souls of the Eldar dead have been producing through their collective presence in the Craftworld circuits. Not summoned, not created through deliberate action, not the product of any tradition or ritual. The natural consequence of what happens when the souls of an entire species accumulate in a connected psychic network across enough time and in sufficient numbers. The infinity circuits of the Craftworlds are connected, not in the direct sense, not in a way that the living Eldar on different Craftworlds can exploit as a communication network, but in the deeper structural sense that they all draw on the same psychic principles, and that the accumulated dead who inhabit them are part of the same broader Eldar spiritual ecosystem. Inead is forming in the space between the circuits, in the connection that the Eldar tradition did not design and does not control entirely. The prophecy that surrounds Ined is one of the most significant in Eldar theology. When the god of the dead has grown strong enough to act, the Eldar believe, Ined will confront Slaanesh and defeat it, the entity that consumed the Eldar pantheon and that waits for every Eldar soul at death will itself be consumed by the god that the Eldar dead have been building through the centuries of their accumulated presence in the infinity circuits. The Farseer Eldrad Ulthran, the most famous of the Craftworld Eldar's living prophets, noted that this might take thousands of Terran years at the very least, and that Ined's awakening would require the passing of every Eldar soul linked to the Eternity Matrix, the network of all the circuits, which would mean the destruction of the Craftworld tradition's entire accumulated past, even as it might guarantee the species a new beginning. The Eldar dead, who had entered the infinity circuits to be protected from Slaanesh, were unknowingly building the weapon that would face the thing that had forced them into the circuits in the first place. The accumulated consequence of the Fool's response was, across enough time, the formation of the means by which the Fool's ultimate cause might be addressed. Whether Ined will be ready before the Craftworld's populations are so reduced that there are not enough dead to complete the formation. Whether the weapon will be finished before the civilization that is building it is gone. Whether the new god will be what the prophecy describes it will be. These questions are open in the 41st millennium, with the answer not yet available. The Ynnari. The forming of Inea did not remain only a background theological process. In recent Eldar history, in the years before the creation of the Great Rift that split the galaxy in the late 41st millennium, a Farseer named Ivrain heard what she understood as the voice of Inead and became its first prophet. The Ynnari, the faction she founded, drew from all of the Eldar's surviving groups. Craftworld Eldar who believed the prophecy and were willing to act on it before Ined's natural formation was complete. Drukhari, who had their own reasons for interest in a future where Slaanesh was defeated. Harlequins, whose loyalty to Commorragh did not preclude engagement with a theological development of this significance. The Ynnari's existence created a new possibility in the Eldar's fragmented political landscape, a common cause that crossed the factional divisions the Fool had created. Not a reunification, not the restoration of the Empire, not anything as simple as the survivors finding common ground. The divisions were too deep and too ancient for that, but a shared investment in the possibility that the thing that had created those divisions might one day be addressed. The elders of the Craftworlds, the conservative tradition that had maintained the path system and the infinity circuit for tens of thousands of years, largely condemned the Ynnari as dangerous and misguided. The path system was the protection that had worked. The Ynnari's belief that Inead's awakening could be accelerated, that action taken now could bring forward the confrontation with Slaanesh, rather than waiting for the natural process to complete, was from the conservative perspective the kind of recklessness that had produced the Fall in the first place, the willingness to act on desire rather than to contain it. The Ynnari's counter to this was not wrong either. The natural process would take thousands of years if it was even guaranteed to produce Inead in the form the prophecy described. The Craftworld's populations were being reduced by the galaxy's ongoing wars faster than they were recovering. The arithmetic of waiting was not obviously better than the arithmetic of acting. The debate between action and patience, between the risk of the Ynnari's approach and the risk of waiting, between the prophetic tradition and the conservative one, was alive in the Eldar's surviving communities in the 41st millennium, with no resolution in sight. It was, in the compressed and darkly comic way that the Warhammer 40,000 universe tends to present its situations, the kind of debate that a people who had survived by discipline rather than desire might expect to find themselves having about a god that was being formed by the dead. Sleep well. Tomorrow we look at what the fall means for the galaxy as a whole, and for the races that inherited the space the Eldar left behind. The galaxy that existed after the fall was not the galaxy that had existed before it. This sounds like an obvious statement, because all catastrophes change things, and the fall was the largest single catastrophe in the galaxy's recorded history. But the changes were specific, not general, and some of them were permanent in the way that a wound in the body's material structure is permanent. Things were different after the fall, not because the attitudes or the politics or the arrangements of power had shifted, but because the physical reality of the galaxy had been altered in ways that could not be reversed. The Eye of Terror was there, 20,000 light years across. The Chaos Gods had a new member in Slaanesh. The warp, which had been in storm for 10,000 years, was calm. The Eldar, who had been the dominant species in the galaxy, were scattered and reduced, and in the process of becoming what the 41st millennium would know them as. And humanity, which had been watching from the margins of Eldar space, had just been given the galaxy. Tonight we follow what the fall produced in the world around the Eldar, in the species that moved into the territory the catastrophe had vacated, and in the permanent structures the fall left behind. The warp calmed. For 10,000 years before Slaanesh's birth, the warp had been in the state of sustained turbulence that the accumulating psychic output of the Eldar's decline had produced. The storms that had made warp travel dangerous, that had isolated human worlds from each other during the period the Imperium later called the Age of Strife, had been the warp's weather during the long approach to the fall. The Age of Strife had been catastrophic for humanity. The isolation it imposed had broken the interstellar civilization that humanity's age of technology had built across the galaxy's accessible volume, separating worlds that had been connected by warp travel into independent polities that could not communicate or trade or support each other. Some worlds had maintained their technological level through the isolation. Many had not. The dark age of technology's achievements, the most sophisticated things humanity had built before the Emperor's unification, had been lost on world after world during the millennia of the Age of Strife. The storms cleared when Slaanesh was born. The psychic energy that had been building in the warp toward the birth spent itself in the birth's violence, and the aftermath of that spending was a period of relative calm in the immaterial dimension. The warp lanes that had been impossible or extremely dangerous to traverse opened. The isolation that had defined the Age of Strife for humanity ended. The Emperor of mankind had been preparing for this opening. He had spent the Age of Strife on Terra, working to unify the birth world of humanity and building the institutional and military foundations for what he intended to do when the galaxy became accessible, when the storms cleared, when the warp lanes opened, when the galaxy became navigable in the way it had not been for 10,000 years. The Emperor launched the Great Crusade. The Crusade was the largest military campaign in human history. Its purpose was the reunification of the scattered human worlds, the restoration of contact and organization and mutual support among the civilizations that the Age of Strife had isolated. Its method was the Space Marines, the superhuman warriors the Emperor had created to carry the Crusade's ambitions into the difficult territories of a galaxy that had been in disorder for millennia. The Crusade moved through the galaxy's volume into the space the Eldar had dominated, not because the humans had conquered Eldar territory in any military sense, because the territory was no longer occupied in the way it had been. The Paradise Worlds and the Eldar colonies and the outpost settlements that had constituted the Eldar Empire's presence across the galaxy were gone or abandoned or occupied by the shadows of what they had been. The Crusade moved into this territory and found it available. The galaxy that the Emperor's Great Crusade was reuniting was the galaxy that the Eldar had shaped. The roads of the webway ran beneath it. The worlds that the Eldar had terraformed and settled and later abandoned still bore the marks of what had been done to them. The humans who arrived in these territories were arriving in a landscape that had been altered by the species they were, in a sense, replacing. Mankind inherited the stars. It is the law's own formulation. In this way, the fall of the Eldar heralded the rise of the Imperium of Man. The most powerful civilization in the galaxy destroyed itself, and the gap it left was filled by the species that had been developing at the margins of its territory for the duration of the Golden Age. The Eye of Terror. The Eye of Terror was not a scar alone, it was a mechanism. The rift between real space and the warp that the fall had torn open became, in the centuries and millennia after the fall, the most significant strategic asset that the Chaos Powers possessed in their ongoing campaign against the ordered civilizations of the galaxy. A permanent interface between the warp and real space, 20,000 light-years across, where the rules of the material dimension were suspended, and where the creatures and forces of the immaterial could exist in a form that was not possible in undamaged real space. Time within the Eye operated differently from time in the galaxy outside it. The distortions of the warp, which were not absent in the Eye, but were the Eye's defining characteristic, made the temporal relationship between inside and outside the Eye unreliable in ways that were militarily significant. A force that retreated into the Eye was a force that did not age and did not require the logistical support of a campaign conducted in normal space, and did not face the attrition that a conventionally besieged army would face. This was why the Eye of Terror became the refuge of the traitor legions after the Horus Heresy. The Space Marine legions that had sided with Horus against the Emperor in the civil war that consumed the Imperium's early centuries were defeated and driven from Terra. They fled. The Eye of Terror was the place they fled to, the location where pursuit was impossible and where the time distortions allowed them to continue existing through the 10,000 years of the 41st millennium in a form that normal human biology could not have sustained. The same Space Marines who had fought against the Emperor in the Horus Heresy were still fighting against the Imperium in the 41st millennium. Abaddon, the Despoiler, who launched the Black Crusades from the Eye of Terror against the Imperium across those 10,000 years, was the inheritor of the Chaos legacy that the traitor legions had built inside the rift. The Eye of Terror, created by the shame of the Eldar, became the instrument of humanity's greatest ongoing threat. The connection between the Fall and the Black Crusades is one that most participants in the Black Crusades did not have in mind. Abaddon did not think of himself as fighting with tools that the Eldar's self-destruction had provided. The Chaos Gods, who sponsored the Black Crusades, were not publicly acknowledging the debt they owed to the species, whose excess had created their newest member. But the chain was there. Fall to Eye of Terror, to Traitor Legion, refuge to Black Crusades, to the ongoing war that defined the 41st millennium's political landscape. Craftworld Ulthwé, one of the largest of the surviving Craftworlds, was caught in the gravitational pull of the Eye of Terror's formation. It now orbits the Eye, its position relative to the rift permanent and unchangeable, its population exposed to the constant pressure of what presses outward from the Eye in a way that no other Craftworld experiences. The proximity has made Ulthway's population unusually psychically sensitive, and has given it a standing militia, the Black Guardians, maintained at levels that other Craftworlds do not require. The Eldar who built the Craftworlds to escape the fall found themselves orbiting the wound the fall had made. The eye that had consumed the homeworlds was the eye around which one of their greatest ships now drifted, its inhabitants spending their lives in proximity to the thing that had destroyed their civilization. The Chaos Gods and the New Balance. Slaanesh's birth changed the Chaos Pantheon. Before Slaanesh, the great powers of Chaos in their organized form were three: Khorne, Nurgle, and Tzeentch. Each occupied its own territory in the warp. Each expressed a different aspect of what Chaos was as a principle. Each had its own followers and its own characteristic forms and its own relationship to the material world it pressed against. Slaanesh arrived and became the fourth, not through negotiation or through the agreement of the existing powers, through the simple fact of existence. A being of sufficient power in the warp is a power in the warp, regardless of whether the existing powers welcome or acknowledge it. Slaanesh took its place as the Chaos God, of excess and pleasure and sensation, adding to the Chaos Pantheon's range in the way that a new instrument adds to an orchestra's capability. The relationships between the Chaos Gods shifted. Khorne and Slaanesh were natural enemies, their principles opposed in the specific way of the blood, God's contempt for everything except the act of killing, and the god of pleasure's orientation toward the refinement of sensation. The interference Khorne had made during the fall, drawing Slaanesh's attention by fighting over Cain, had established the enmity that their followers carried into the 41st Millennium's wars. Chaos forces fighting each other across the galaxy were, in many cases, acting out this enmity between their patrons. Nurgle and Slaanesh had a different relationship. The Plague Father and the Prince of Pleasure shared the territory of sensation, though their expressions of it were opposite in quality. Nurgle held Aisha captive in his domain, the Eldar goddess of harvest, whose nature had made her the target of a god, whose own nature was about what happened to living things when they decayed. The law's account of why Nurgle kept Aisha, rather than consuming her outright, as Slaanesh consumed the other Eldar gods, is not explained in full. She remains in Nurgle's domain, tending to what she can, in circumstances that the surviving Eldar do not know and cannot access. The psychic shockwave of Slaanesh's birth had not been limited to the Eldar. Billions of humans, orcs, and other races across the galaxy had been destroyed or driven insane as the birth's force propagated. Psychers of all races, whose sensitivity to the warp made them the most exposed to what the birth produced, had howled as the birth scream passed through them. The galaxy's general psychic ecology had been changed by the addition of a Chaos God of this power in this way. What the Eldar became to the other races. The Eldar of the 41st Millennium are not the Eldar of the Golden Age, not in scale, not in capability, not in how they present to the other species that share the galaxy with them. To the humans of the Imperium, the Eldar are ambiguous. They were there before humanity, which gives them a kind of status, and the ruins of their civilization are scattered across the galaxy in ways that Imperial archaeologists and inquisitors investigate with a combination of academic interest and institutional anxiety. They are also a recurring presence in the conflicts of the 41st Millennium, appearing on the borders of Imperial space and in the territories the Imperium contests, and occasionally fighting alongside Imperial forces and more occasionally fighting against them. The Eldar's agenda, from the Imperial perspective, is never legible. They do things for reasons that the Imperium does not always discover until after the outcome. To the Orcs, the Eldar are opponents of a particular quality: fast, skilled, and intensely annoying in the way that opponents who refuse to stand still and fight in the manner Orcs prefer are annoying. The Orcs hold no specific resentment against the Eldar for what the Eldar's Golden Age had done to them, because the Orc relationship to history does not preserve specific resentments across the timescales involved. They fight Eldar in the present tense for the reasons that Orcs fight, which are the reasons that are immediately available. To the Necrons, who had been the original enemy of the species, the Old Ones had created the Eldar to fight. The Eldar are a complicated presence. The Necrons, who are awakening from their long sleep in the 41st millennium, find a galaxy change beyond recognition from the one they knew. The species that had been created against them is now scattered and diminished. The Old Ones who had created them are gone. The Chaos Gods whose creation had contributed to the Old Ones' defeat are present in the warp in ways they were not during the war in heaven. The Eldar are reviled by other races for their tendency to focus on their own survival, often at the expense of those other races' well-being. The treachery and subterfuge that Eldar factions have employed across the 41st millennium, the manipulation of human and other forces toward Eldar ends without disclosure of what the ends were, has produced a reputation that the Eldar have not tried to improve. Their assessment of the other races, the humans and the Orcs and the various others, carries the residue of the Golden Age's confidence in Eldar superiority. They are trying to survive in a galaxy that they once dominated. The awareness of the distance between what they were and what they are is constant. The humans who watch an Eldar farsa are watching a being whose lineage created the galaxy's greatest civilization and whose lineage destroyed it. The awareness of both facts shapes everything the Eldar do, including how they present to those they deal with. The slow extinction. The Eldar of the 41st millennium are in decline. Not catastrophically, not at the rate of the fall itself, but measurably, consistently, in the way that a population that does not reproduce at the rate it loses members declines across the generations. Eldar reproduction is slow. The species that the Old Ones created with such psychic intensity and such depth of experience produces children with the care and the rarity that intense experience requires. A Craftworld that loses a significant portion of its population in battle does not recover that population in a generation or two. The recovery takes centuries, and the battles of the 41st millennium do not stop to allow the centuries of recovery. The Wraithguard and Wraithlords that walk the halls of Craftworlds like Eondon are there because the living population cannot defend the ship without them. The dead who were retrieved from the Infinity Circuit to pilot Wraith constructs are there because the arithmetic of reproduction versus loss has tilted in a direction that no farser's long-term planning can reverse in the short term. The Eldar know they are declining. The Farseers, whose planning extends centuries forward, can see the trajectories that the population data implies, and the trajectories are not stable. This is why the Inari's approach to the problem of Slaanesh, whatever its risks, has attracted followers from all the Eldar's surviving groups. The Par system and the Infinity Circuit have sustained the Craftworld tradition for tens of thousands of years. They have not reversed the direction in which the population is moving. The Eldar fear that humanity, the inheritors of their galaxy, will repeat what the Eldar did. The law states this outright. The Eldar mourn for what was lost, and fear that humanity, the foolish humans, will replicate their arrogance and its terrible consequences for the galaxy. at a scale that the galaxy might not survive a second time. This fear is not entirely unwarranted. The humans of the 41st millennium are not the measured and disciplined civilization that Eldar farcers would construct if they had the opportunity. They are a vast and varied and often chaotic species whose survival across 10,000 years of the Imperium's existence has required an institutional structure that is, in certain ways, as unsustainable as the Golden Age's excess was. The Eldar, who observe the Imperium, see a civilization that is sustaining itself through the same combination of confidence in its own centrality and refusal to reckon with what threatens it that the Eldar's Golden Age had displayed. Whether this comparison is accurate or whether it is the projection of a species that destroyed itself onto a species that has not yet, is a question that the 41st millennium's ongoing events have not yet resolved. Sleep well. Tomorrow, the final part. What the fall means at the level of what the story is doing. The galaxy's relationship to the civilization that shaped it, and what kind of story it is to be the survivors of something that large. Let everything slow. We have followed the Eldar from the beginning, from the war in heaven and the Old Ones who built them as weapons against the Necrons, through the Golden Age that those weapons built when the war was over, through the centuries of the slow decline and the pleasure cults and the feedback loop that fed what was forming in the warp, through the night that ended the Empire, through the survivors and what each group built from what remained, through the Craftworlds and their path system and their infinity circuits, and their slow drift through a galaxy that humanity was now filling, through Commorragh and the dark mechanism of pain as sustenance, through the laughing god in the webway, and the Harlequins who carry the memory of the dances, through the Exodites on their maiden worlds, and Cain in his fragments, and Inead forming in the accumulated dead. Now we sit with what the story was doing all along. Aeldari. The shape of the story. The Fall of the Eldar is the Warhammer 40,000 universe's most complete account of how a civilization destroys itself. Not how it is destroyed by an external enemy, not how it is overwhelmed by circumstances beyond its control, but how a species with every advantage available managed to create the conditions of its own catastrophe from the inside. The shape of the story is familiar. A civilization at the height of its power, secure enough to stop attending to the things that made it secure, able enough to pursue desires that the earlier stages of its development had not permitted, discovers across generations that the pursuit of desires without the management of their consequences produces something that the pursuit itself does not acknowledge. The particular version of this shape that the Eldar story presents is the psychic version. A species whose connection to the warp meant that their collective desires were not merely personal, but cosmological, that the accumulated output of billions of Eldar pursuing pleasure without discipline was not staying within the Eldar, but was reaching the warp and building something there. The consequence was not merely social or political or civilizational in the ordinary sense, it was ontological. The consequences of the Eldar's choices shaped the fabric of reality. This is the Warhammer 40,000 universe's specific addition to a familiar story structure. The fall is not metaphor. Slaanesh is not a symbol of what decadence produces in a culture. Slaanesh is what decadence produces, given the specific physics of a universe where psychic output has material consequences in the immaterial dimension that shapes the material one. The lesson the Eldar story seems to want to teach is the lesson that many stories of civilizational decline want to teach, that excess has consequences. The universe in which the story is told makes those consequences literal rather than figurative. What it means to be a survivor. The Eldar of the 41st millennium are survivors of something that most beings in the galaxy have no comparable experience of. Not survivors of a battle or of a war, or of a catastrophe that was external and that the civilization recovered from. Survivors of their own civilization's self-destruction. The situation where the thing that destroyed what you belong to was what you belong to itself. This produces a specific psychological and cultural condition that the Craftworld tradition has spent tens of thousands of years managing. The path system, the infinity circuit, the long planning of the farseers. These are not the practical responses alone of a species that needed new survival mechanisms after losing its homeworlds. They are also the cultural responses of a people who need to be a different kind of people than the ones who produced the catastrophe they are surviving. The Eldar of the Craftworlds carry the knowledge that their species made Slaanesh. Not that their ancestors made Slaanesh. Not that some other Eldar made Slaanesh. They understand, as a civilizational fact, that their culture preserves through the Harlequins' dances and the farseers' planning and the architecture of the path system, that what they are by nature, the psychic intensity and the depth of desire and the particular quality of Eldar consciousness, is what made Slaanesh. The danger is not external, it is internal. It is them. The path system is the management of this knowledge, the discipline it requires, the focus on one thing at a time, the renunciation of the kind of undirected desire that the Golden Age had permitted. All of it is the cultural encoding of the understanding that what the Eldar are capable of becoming is the worst thing they have produced. Every Craftworld Eldar walks the path with the knowledge that without the path, without the discipline, without the management of the intensity that makes them what they are, the feedback loop could begin again. The Drukhari, who did not adopt the path system, carry a different version of the same knowledge. They understand what they are capable of. They have not chosen to manage it. They have chosen to direct it outward toward others as the mechanism of their survival. The knowledge of the Eldar's nature that the Craftworld tradition uses as the argument for discipline is the same knowledge the Drukhari use as the argument for the necessity of what they do. Both groups are right about the knowledge. They differ about the response. The Laughing God's joke. Tegorak's position in the Fool's narrative deserves a moment's attention in this final reckoning. The god who survived because his nature was incompatible with the excess that fed Slaanesh. The trickster who escaped while the other gods were consumed, whose followers preserved the memory of what the Eldar were, and whose performances are the only continuous account of the fall that the Eldar's surviving cultures share. His pranks and jokes, the law notes, punish gods and mortals alike for the sin of pride. He had been present through the entire Golden Age, maintaining the performances that reminded the Eldar of the principles their gods represented, performing the dances that encoded the warnings that the seers were also giving in less entertaining form. He had been the warning that nobody adequately listened to. He survived. The species that had not listened survived partially. The gods that had not intervened had not survived. The trickster, who had been laughing at the pride of everything around him, found himself in the webway, hiding from the thing the pride had made, taking the only joke seriously, the one where the person who says do not do this thing is the only one left when the thing is done. The Harlequins perform the dance without end across the galaxy, telling the story of the fall to the Eldar's scattered populations, keeping the dances that Tegorak maintained alive through the catastrophe. They tell the story to people who lived through its consequences, who carry in their bodies the infinity circuits and the spirit stones and the damage of the birth scream's passage. The audience knows the ending. They have been living in the ending for 40,000 years. The dance without end is performed anyway. The ending the audience knows is not the only ending. Ynad is forming in the infinity circuits. The prophecy is that the Fall's worst product will itself be faced in time by what the Fall's survivors have accumulated. The dance continues because the story is not over. The Eldar and the question of hubris. The Eldar had a word for what they did. The civilization that at the height of its golden age had dismissed the warnings of seers, that had abandoned the gods who encoded its principles, that had pursued desire past the limits that the principles had been designed to maintain. They named what produced the full hubris. The overreach of a species that believed its own greatness had released it from the constraints that made greatness possible. Hubris is a concept that appears across many cultural traditions, not only the Greek one from which the English word comes, the idea that the height of achievement is the most dangerous position, because it is the position where the caution that achieved the height seems least necessary, appears in traditions that have no connection to each other, except the shared observation of how civilizations fail. The Eldar's version of this recognition has a specific quality that most other traditions' versions do not. In most accounts of hubris and its consequences, the consequences are proportionate to the scale of the overreach. The Eldar's overreach produced a chaos god that is still active in the 41st millennium, still consuming Eldar souls at death, still the reason that every Craftworld Eldar wears a spirit stone and walks the path, and lives with the weight of what the path is protecting against. The consequence of the Eldar's hubris was a permanent feature of the galaxy's cosmological structure. The Eye of Terror is 40,000 years old, and it is still there. Slaanesh is 40,000 years old, and it is still there. The Eldar of the 41st millennium are the species that produce both of these things, and that lives in the shadow of both of them, managing their existence with a discipline that their ancestors refused. The distance between the Golden Age's confidence and the 41st millennium's careful survival is the measure of what hubris produced in a universe where the consequences of excess are not bounded by the individual or the generation, but propagate into the immaterial and reshape the material. The mirror and the warning. The Eldar's fear for humanity is not unfounded, and the Warhammer 40,000 universe does not present it as unfounded. The Imperium of Man that inherited the galaxy in the aftermath of the Fall has certain characteristics that a reader of the Eldar's history might find familiar. A civilization at the center of the galaxy's dominant power, an institutional confidence in its own centrality that shapes how it responds to threats, a religious and political structure that has become, across the 10,000 years of the Age of Imperium, an inheritance performed more and more out of habit, rather than out of the genuine understanding that motivated its founding. A population whose leaders make decisions based on the doctrine of the institution, rather than on the direct assessment of what the circumstances require. The Imperium is not the Golden Age. It is not pursuing pleasure. Its problems are different in character from the Golden Age's excess, but the underlying structure, the relationship between a dominant civilization and the question of whether it is attending to what made it dominant, has a recognizable shape to anyone who has traced the Eldar's arc from the beginning. The Eldar are not neutral observers of this. They are the species that made the worst possible version of the mistake. They're farseers, whose planning extends centuries forward. Watch the Imperium with the particular attention of people who know from personal civilizational experience what the early stages of a certain kind of failure look like. They do not warn humanity consistently or comprehensively or in terms that the Imperium would accept. They work through manipulation and subterfuge, and the placing of pieces on a board that the Imperium does not know is a board. This is not a comfortable form of concern for its recipients, but it is the form that a species whose survival has required the management of their own nature across 40,000 years brings to the question of what to do about a neighboring civilization that shows certain familiar signs, whether the warning is accurate, whether the Imperium is on the trajectory the Eldar fear, whether the galaxy's next great catastrophe will have the shape the Farsers see in their long-range assessment. These questions are open in the 41st millennium and are among the things the ongoing narrative of Warhammer 40,000 holds without resolving. What the Fall left. The galaxy of the 41st millennium is the galaxy that the Fall shaped. The Eye of Terror, from which the Chaos forces press against the Imperium in the Black Crusades. The Chaos Pantheon, with its 4 members rather than 3. The newest of them, the specific product of one species' specific failure. The Craftworlds drifting through space, the Drukhari raiding from the webway, the Harlequins performing their dances, the Exodites tending their worlds, the Necrons waking to find that the species created to fight them has been reduced while they slept, humanity expanding into territory that the Eldar had shaped, and in the infinity circuits, among the accumulated dead of tens of thousands of years, the forming of something that did not exist when the Fall happened, and that might, in time, address what the Fall produced. The fall of the Eldar is the opening wound of the 41st millennium. Everything that defines the galaxy's current state traces back to it, either as a direct consequence or as the response of other forces to the gap the Fall created. The Imperium of Man exists because the warp storms cleared when Slaanesh was born. The Eye of Terror exists because the homeworlds were at its center when the rift opened. The Chaos Gods are 4 because the Eldar's excess was great enough to create a 4th. The Eldar are scattered because they were the species that created all of this. They are still here. Fewer than they were, more careful than they were, carrying the weight of what they know about what their nature can produce when it is not managed. In the webway, in the Craftworlds, on the Maiden Worlds, in Commorragh, in the infinity circuits, in the spirit stones, in the dances of the Harlequins, and the long plans of the Farseers, and the forming presence of the god who might one day face the thing the Fall built. This has been the entire fall of the Eldar, told slowly, over 8 nights, from the old ones who built them as weapons, through the golden age they built with what the old ones gave them, through the centuries of the slow decline and the feedback loop and the night that ended the homeworlds, into the aftermath, and the various ways of surviving it, and the galaxy that inherited what the survivors left behind, for the quiet between waking and whatever waits in the dark. Good night, my dear friend.